Dylan Taylor is here. And Dylan Taylor is an entrepreneur. He made a fortune outside of the space business, which is how it's generally done. And then he launched two important ventures. One is Voyager Space, which promises to be a new type of space company. And I should mention, Voyager Space has acquired a majority share of my own company, Pioneer Astronautics. So in addition to being president of Pioneer and Astronautics, I'm one of several vice presidents of Voyager, the vice president for planetary systems. But he also is the founder of an outfit called Space for Humanity, which is a nonprofit which attempts to bring both the benefits and the experience of space to humanity. And Dylan himself has gone into space on one of the Blue Origin flights because he both wanted to do it and also considers it important. And people like him who have the resources are necessary to get a new activity like this off the ground. It's like anything else. You know, only rich people had color TVs to start, or cell phones or whatever. But they want to make this generally available to people and for all it means. So Dylan Taylor, please come to the front.
Testing, test. Thank you, Robert. I appreciate that kind introduction. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Super excited to be here at the Mars Society 25th Annual Convention. And today I'm going to mix it up a little bit, not so technical, my remarks. I'm going to be talking a little bit more, what can we expect as we look forward in the new space industry? And one of the observations I have is because I came from outside the space industry and was in finance, banking, and real estate, and electronics, perhaps that perspective lends a kind of fresh set of eyes to what this industry is likely to evolve into over time. And so I want to bring sort of some of those thoughts to bear today. And I've got 7 specific predictions I'll make at the end of the presentation. So the first point to make is, just need to advance here. Can you give a hand? Somebody, it's not working. We can go to space, but we can't run PowerPoint apparently.
Should just be this little clicker here.
Okay, got it. Thank you. User error in this case. So the first point is we really are going exponential, right? So if you look at every business plan probably ever written, you always have the hockey stick growth, which is always promised in the future but never comes. But we really are hitting that inflection point in the industry. So serious people are paying attention to the industry. And these are some figures from an investment bank, Morgan Stanley, but the bottom line here is it will be a multi-trillion-dollar industry as early as 2030, but everyone agrees certainly by 2040. So what does that mean? Why do we care? Well, if you look at the way industries evolve, pick banking or finance or any industry you can think of, typically what happens is you have rapid growth, you have consolidation, and then the growth basically flattens and you end up with essentially an oligopoly at the top. It's the classic 80-20 rule. 80% of the market is controlled by 20% of the participants. You have a big four accounting firms, big four investment bank, big four aerospace primes. And then you have the upstarts. And initially the primes are kind of, or the big four are patting these new entrants on the head saying, nice little space company, nice little accounting firm. But because they're innovating and because they're bringing new ideas, ultimately they end up disrupting the industry. And that's really where we are. And the interesting thing to me about disruption is it typically comes from the lower use cases, which I think is fascinating. And the reason this happens, there was a great book written by Clayton Christensen called Innovator's Dilemma, Harvard professor, passed a couple of years ago. And he made the observation that it's very, very difficult to disrupt yourself, right? Because there's a lot of inertia. It's hard to see things clearly. There are a lot of internal incentives within any institution to preserve the status quo, Robert just touched on SLS. I'll leave that one there, but there's a lot of connective tissue that requires you to kind of keep things in place. But what happens is as those use cases become better because the new entrants are innovating quicker, ultimately they reach a point where the product is still not quite as good as the best product in the market, but it's so much dramatically cheaper that the entire market inverts. And that's really what we've seen with launch and SpaceX. So just to punctuate this, that thin blue line at the bottom are global PC sales. The hockey stick are global smartphone sales. So for those of you old enough to remember, 2006, pre-iPhone, if you had a Palm Pilot, if I were to tell you that's going to disrupt your compact 386 computer that was on your desk, or your Pentax camera that cost $800, you would have said I was crazy. But not only did that happen, the key point here is the market actually expanded. So it didn't replace PCs, it actually grew the market. And now I think it's about 2 billion global iPhone and Android sales. So what is enabling this disruption? There's a lot of different answers to that. I'm going to touch on 3 quickly. The first one is probably the most obvious, launch reusability. Obviously, we all know this. We've been flying an Airbus 380 from Dallas to Dubai, and we've been throwing the airplane away. And we've been doing that for 60 years. And then we wonder why no one can afford to fly, right? That's what we've been doing. And for me, the game really changed. I had the privilege of being at this launch, the Falcon Heavy, February 18, dual rocket booster landing. First time in my life, I literally rubbed my eyes because I couldn't believe what I saw. So to me, that's what really sparked the imagination around reusability. That's when I knew it was real. And now SpaceX is launching essentially every 6 days, roughly, which is pretty unbelievable. Launch costs are dropping dramatically. We all know that. Space shuttle is roughly 100,000 pounds to orbit, which is crazy. And then what's going to change the game, in my view, is Starship. And I am a Starship believer. I did a 3-day deep dive in Boca Chica at the invitation of SpaceX, and I'm convinced that they have what it takes to pull this off. And I do think this will be a game changer. Well, what else is happening? Obviously, now that we've built the elevator into space, we have a revolution in hardware. And you all know this phenomenon, but the Worldview satellite far left there, that was a digital globe asset, put up every 10 years, cost $60, $70 million, could take a picture of your license plate from orbit. Well, that's great, but most use cases didn't need that level of fidelity. So enter the upstarts, enter Planet Labs, enter these other hardware innovators. They don't need to build hardware that's going to last 10 years because they're going to put up another version of the constellation within a year or two. So all the hardware electronics can be redesigned. The cost goes way down, and all of a sudden you're benefiting from Moore's law. So there's something called the megaset, which I refer to as a term that just means the data set that we're building. So what is this industry going to be worth? Well, if you think about Google, or Alphabet, as it's now called at the parent company level, it's essentially $1 trillion company. And what they've done essentially is organize terrestrial known information, which is a big project, but they'll tell you if a restaurant's open and how to get there and who said what when, but it's not going to tell you what will happen in the future. So imagine a persistent, ubiquitous database that has perfect real-time information about global commerce on the Earth that has predictive capabilities to it. What is that data set worth? Well, certainly more than $1 trillion. Right? So if you aggregate all these different constellations, if you aggregate all the hardware projects that are going on, the sum total is going to equal something like that. Now, who are the winners and losers going to be? I don't know. I think it's a little bit like e-commerce back in the early 2000s. Everyone knew it was going to be massive. But had you picked, Beyond.com, which was selling software, versus Amazon.com, which was selling books, you would have gotten it wrong. But if you would have just bet the market, you would have gotten it right. So I do see a huge opportunity for the industry in this direction with ones and zeros. All right, so let's talk about one other disruption near and dear to my heart, which is, I'm going to call it space tourism. I don't like that term, but it seems to be sticking in the industry. And just definitionally, there's this big controversy. What is space? Where's the Kármán line? Some people say 100 kilometers. I'm in the camp that says it's about 54-ish miles, because the definition of space in my mind is the absence of aerodynamic lift. So depending on where you are on the Earth and the temperature, it's roughly 54 miles. That's my definition. So there have been 621 people who've gotten over that line in the whole history of humanity, which blows my mind. I think I was number 606. And just to put it in perspective, even of that number, only 24 were deep enough in space to actually be able to put their thumb over the blue orb, if you will, right? Because even if you're at the ISS, it's essentially an arc of the Earth that you're seeing. So 24 people total, and then of course of that, only 12 landed on the moon, and there's something like 110 billion people who've lived. So, you know, we're just barely emerging from the womb here. And just for fun, the billionaire number probably changes every hour, but call it 2,500 billionaires, 1,000 Nobel Prize winners. You're literally more likely to be a billionaire or a Nobel Prize winner than have been to space. That's how rare it is. And that is going to change. Everyone in this room, of course, probably already knows someone who's been to space, but I think pick any room in any city in the next 5 or 6 years, I think people will all know an astronaut. And so why it's been 50+ million to go, it's quite expensive. That's being changed, as we know, by a lot of the suborbital flights. That's Spaceport America, New Mexico, Virgin Galactic. Complicated design. For those of you who don't know, the plane takes the spacecraft to about 55,000 feet, and then there's a drop maneuver where the plane is dropped and then the rocket launch happens. Blue Origin is an up and down rocket with a reusable booster. This is the one I went on. And as that booster goes above the Kármán line, you get stage separation and the capsule continues onward. And it's quite a view. I can attest to that. It was a life changer for me, truly. And then of course there's a whole controversy around these wings. My crew and I, bottom left and bottom right, got really essentially the last set of FAA wings awarded. The FAA's out of the business of awarding commercial astronaut wings because it's become political. So I was lucky to do that. So, you know, what's the price going to be? Eventually 450,000-ish. It's not there yet. It's quite a bit more expensive than that. But $450,000 is still a lot of money, as we all know, but it's not $50 million. And then why does this matter? Why do we care about a bunch of, you know, rich early entrants going to space? That's a good question, and I think it's a valid question. But in my mind, it stimulates a lot of this interest in space. Ultimately, our business is funded by the public, right? If you look at the main user, which is primarily governments, universities, research institutions, public sentiment matters. Public sentiment matters. So I think to the extent that we can promote space and the power of space to transform, I think it helps us all. And so what about the rest of humanity? Robert was kind enough to touch on a global nonprofit I founded, Space for Humanity. We have sent 2 people to space this year, including the first Mexican-born female and the first African-born female to go to space. They're doing amazing work. And the idea is that you send them, you pay for them to go, but in return, they have to essentially do a fellowship to do something to benefit Earth, whether to inspire the next generation of STEM students or whatever project they pick. The idea is, how do we engender in our young people a sense of hope that they can be part of this space revolution that we're going through? And that anyone, you know, can go to space ultimately. That's certainly my goal. I believe in the life-changing powers of space. So what's holding us back? What are the impediments? What challenges does the industry have? What do we need to focus on? You know, some of this is important. It's finance related, but it's important to the people in this room to understand where the edges are and how we can all help each other to reduce some of these. Part of the issue with space investments is they're illiquid, right? We don't have a lot of publicly traded companies. So when you make a space investment, you might not get your capital back for years and years and years. All different kinds of risk, technical risk, as we all know, financial risk, but regulatory risk, right? Administrations change, politics change. Very high CapEx, right? There's a lot of money to get things off the ground, literally and figuratively. And then the time horizons are quite long. So those are the challenges. And the good news is the expected returns are very, very high. So if you get a company that does well, you're talking 200, 300, 400x returns, which literally is not available in really any other industry at this point in time. The key thing here, and this is the message I want to leave you with, is collaboration matters. So to the extent that we had more industry standards, to the extent that we were flying in tighter formation around the types of technologies we're using, the more that those technology costs go down, the more certainty we have in execution, and ultimately the more certainty we can give investors. The more certainty we can give investors, the more the capital flows into the industry, and then we all benefit. So I'm a big believer in collaboration. I'm a big believer in really optimizing industry standards, a lot more communication around that. And yeah, so that would be my call to action. So a new issue, which is really an old issue, which I know Robert's play touched on. Geopolitics is really becoming complicated, very, very complicated. So we've got Russia as an issue on the ISS. We've got China as an issue. We have other space-based powers that have emerged, like India, like Iran in particular. And we're going to be entering a post-ISS world at some point. I'm in the camp that says the ISS is one of the best things humans have ever done. And I think it's one of the key things that have kept the world safe and stable over time. That's, I think it deserves a Nobel Prize, truly. I really believe that. But as we enter the last phases of the ISS, I think we run the risk that those partnerships unravel. And so Voyager, the company I run, is part of building Starlab, which will be a replacement to the ISS. There are other projects underway as well. But I think more than just getting the technical part right and the market right, I think getting the geopolitics and the collaboration right will also be incredibly important. And just, an observation I have, this is back to the kind of big company versus small company. Oftentimes the companies that have the capability in our industry lack the ambition to do bold things, and the companies that have the ambition lack the capability, right? So I think we're entering a phase now, and hopefully Voyager is one example, and there's others where we can assemble capability and ambition to really drive some of these activities. Okay, let me give you 7 predictions by the end of 2025, and I know this is being recorded, so I will be held accountable to this. And as Yogi Berra said, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future, which I think is hilarious, attributed to Yogi. All right, well, let me just hit you with a few, and then I'm happy to take your questions. So this one's probably not too controversial, but between now and the end of 2025, we're going to have more new astronauts minted. That's above that 54-ish mile Kármán line. Between now and the end of 2025 than any other decade. So we're going to have 100 plus astronauts minted between now and the end of 2025, perhaps a lot more than that if we can get Virgin flying. Right now they're not flying. Blue is grounded a little bit because they've got to investigate the anomaly they had on their last one. If Starship flies, which I believe it definitely will during this time period, we could see dozens of humans go to orbit at a time. But that's one prediction I have. Second, I think this is a total game changer for the industry. We will have demonstrated point-to-point transport via rocket. So probably not humans. Ideally you'd go Tokyo to London for $50,000 and you get your astronaut wings along the way. And it would take you 35 minutes. I think eventually that's where we're headed. But I think there's logistics need, especially from a defense standpoint, to do material transport point to point. I think this will be demonstrated. This is a game changer. If you look at rapid logistics and the need for that and or commercial airline market, it dwarfs some of the numbers that I referred to earlier. So if we can do this safely and economically, it's going to totally change the game. But we will have demonstrated that technology. We will have demonstrated successful orbital refueling. This will happen. I think it'll happen probably early 2024, if not late 2023, but it'll definitely happen by the end of 2025. And this is really, really, really important. This is really important for deep space missions. This is really important to build infrastructure in space. Okay, we won't have, in my opinion, have landed another human on the moon by the end of 2025, but I do think we will have, I think Elon and team will have a Starship on their way to Mars. I think there's a window, you guys will correct me, Q4 2024. I think they hit that window. There won't be humans on that, but I think they're gonna send a Starship on that trajectory. If they miss that, I think the next window is 2026 Q4. But I believe very strongly Elon's very serious about doing this. And I think this will happen. Of course, they need to demonstrate the orbital refueling, right? It's sequential in a sense. Okay, well, this one I kind of alludes to what I said earlier. We're going to have we're going to have more consolidation within the new space industry, and we'll have the emergence of the big four kind of mini primes coming out of that. Now, whether they're going to disrupt the current primes dramatically or not, I'm a bit skeptical, because the current primes have huge businesses where space is just a small part of it. But I do think you'll see more industry consolidation. These mini primes, as I'm calling it, won't just be launch or hardware. They'll be integrated firms that have both of those things. So look for more consolidation across vertical lines. I think that'll be a big part of what we're going to see happen during this market cycle. Okay, two more predictions. I'm going to wrap up. Prediction 6. This one, it's a little bit of a mind bender, but we're not going to talk about the space industry at the end of 2025. It's not an industry. It's not. It's a domain, right? We're going to talk about the space market. It'd be like saying, yeah, the China industry. I'm in the China industry. I'm in the Los Angeles industry. It makes no sense, right? So when you're in a industry, banking, finance, R&D, whatever industry you happen to be in at the time, the question is going to be, how are you addressing the space market, right? So it's going to be a complete change in the way we think. Space is a domain, right? And so I think that's going to be particularly insightful. There's an HBR, Harvard Business Review article, I think that was published yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, that says every company needs a space strategy. So if the HBRs of the world are thinking this way, I can promise you it's going to work its way into McKinsey and all these other consultants that have the year of the Fortune 1000. So that's where we're headed. But it will be the space market. And then last but not least, probably not too controversial either, but I think you'll see deeper delineation on this. We are going to have two different ecosystems. We'll have a Western-led ecosystem. We'll have a Chinese-led ecosystem. There'll be very little overlap between those two. So think of it as sort of Apple and iPhone, or Apple and Android. I think that's where we're headed. And I think that demarcation is going to be even starker. And, just one question I'm going to leave you with, and then I'll take your questions if we have time, is I think this is a really important question. The answer to this really, really, really matters. Are we going to have the first human born in space, or are we going to have the first combat fatality happen in space? And I think the answer to that question is really going to determine, how this world looks and how space looks in the future. So with that, I'd love to take your questions.
Hi, thanks for speaking to us. It was very interesting. As you know, there's more than one space-oriented government agency. The Department of Defense is a big player in space and space buying and
Right.
so on and so forth, and objectives. Based on your futuristic look at everything, how do you see whether impediment or value to the future of the industry that you just spoke of, the Department of Defense playing?
I think it's a huge, huge, huge part of the future numbers that I showed earlier. So I think the spending in space roughly is 10-1 right now, DoD to civil space. It's hard to know that because some of the programs are classified. So huge dollars for sure. And the more the China-US ecosystem plays out, the more defense dollars flow to space, I believe. As I said earlier, with it not being a space industry, being a space market, that's very similar with the way the DoD is thinking as well. It's a domain. It's the ultimate high ground, right? So I anticipate funding being dramatically higher as well. By the way, it's not just the US Department of Defense. There are other Five Eyes, so-called Five Eyes nations. Australia comes to mind, very, very focused on space-based defense. So I think that's going to be a huge theme for sure. The thing that I think is interesting about the defense side, unlike civil space, it seems to be less politicized. It seems to be more of a bipartisan issue, whereas civil space has the tendency to be a little bit more party specific, or certainly administration specific. But yeah, great question. I anticipate huge focus on DoD. I'm not sure who's, sorry, she's behind you here.
Okay. You mentioned about we're moving from an industry supporting access to space to industry in space. Currently, we measure progress in the number of astronauts to space. As we make that switch to production space, or however we do it, what will the new metrics be? How we will measure our success?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it'll be eventually the standard metrics, like how many jobs are space related, how much commerce is being generated space related. It's almost like, think of a financial report from a company. How much of your revenue, your EBITDA is being generated by that domain versus something else. So I think ultimately it's going to be that. Whether we have an interim step of metrics between where we are today in terms of number of humans going, number of satellites flown, right? Or, as you're alluding to, our metrics are very rudimentary, right? We talk about, pieces of hardware, we talk about humans, but I think ultimately it's going to be how much revenue is generated with space-based assets and how many jobs are space related. I think those are two key ones. It's a great question though.
Yes, thank you. Very enjoyable talk. I wanted to ask for a prediction of when the first human will land on Mars, but also I wanted to amplify your comments on the ISS. It's the one area where the nations must get together, including the Russians, and behave as if there's some kind of adult supervision.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm an optimist. I believe in what Elon and SpaceX is capable of doing, especially when they're really focused on it, which I hope they sort of return their focus, frankly, to Mars. I think it's important. I'm in the camp. I think the last window in the 2020s is, I think it's what, Q1 2030, I think is the last launch window this decade, basically. I think they hit that window, which would put us on Mars 8 months later. So what would that be? July of 2030. I think that's, if I have my math right, I think that's right. That would be what I would say. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you for your talk, Dylan. Colleen here. You talked a little bit about the Space for Humanity. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about that. I know you guys are doing a lot of really great work over there. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So applications are being accepted to go to space. Essentially, I think there's 7,000 applications currently on file from 60 plus countries. I don't run the organization. Phenomenal talent named Rachel Lyons is the executive director. I still remain on the board. I was the founder. We flew 2 astronauts this year. I hope we could fly another one this year, but I don't, it's not likely Blue would be able to fly because I think they're still trying to troubleshoot this anomaly, but hopefully we can fly another couple next year. So I would encourage, any of you in the audience who have an interest to apply for sure. Yeah, thank you. Last question, are we done? Okay, thank you so much, everybody.